Now, so it's the 80-year anniversary of Joe Louis against Max Schmeling 2, which is a story worth touching on for a whole host of reasons. From a sporting context, it was absolutely noteworthy, a heavyweight title fight. Two very interesting people, different backgrounds. There were broader political and social meanings as well. Not least, it was USA and democracy, and a black man against Germany and fascism, and a white man. There was also a bit of broadcasting history as well. This went out on NBC radio and was listened to by 70 million people to Clem McCarthy's broadcast. Not a figure likely to be repeated again in today's more fractured market. So with all that in mind, 80 years on, we're joined by David Margolick, who is the author of Beyond Glory, Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, and A World on the Brink. David, you're very welcome. I've outlined things very broadly there. It's a rich tapestry. We're going to do well to scratch the surface here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and really, even hearing you set up this piece, I get moved all over again, because I think there was really never another sporting event like it.
No doubt. Can we start with a little bit about Joe Louis and Max Schmeling and just their backgrounds, just to set the scene? So, Joe Louis, born in Alabama, lived much of his life, early years in Detroit, certainly, and around the time he reaches 1930s, he's a very successful professional boxer.
That's right, and successful, not just in the ring. I mean, also successful outside the ring in the larger American society, in that he was acceptable to white America in a way that no black boxer had been for many years, since the reign of Jack Johnson. And that had, in some ways, set black America back, because Jack Johnson was such a divisive figure. And Joe Louis was the one who sort of broke that barrier again and worked his way into the affection of all Americans, white and black, which was really quite a significant accomplishment. And that was the reason why he was even in the ranks of heavyweight contenders. I mean, they were not going to give another title shot to a black man who wasn't acceptable. And Joe Louis managed to become acceptable to white America, while being an absolutely catalyzing figure in the black world, a figure of absolutely enormous symbolic importance.
Because needless to say, it was still a very difficult time for the vast majority of black fighters and black people generally. Jim Crow law still mandated racial segregation, so there were still bouts ruled illegal in most jurisdictions in the South between whites and blacks. And then in the North, as you said, to an extent he had won people over, but it was still very much of its day. Like, I was reading various extracts from press in the north of the country, which frequently used phrases like darky, or, called him an animal or things like that. So it was acceptance in the context of its day.
Yeah, that's right. Although I should say that he was, it wasn't just a kind of condescending acceptance. It was certainly that, condescending, prejudicial, disparaging, even though accepting in some instances. But at the same time, he was liked and respected and treated with respect in other quarters of the press. So, he was a groundbreaker in that sense, too. The treatment of him was not at all uniformly disparaging.
What about Max Schmeling, then, from Germany?
Well, Max Schmeling was someone who had kind of an ambiguous relationship with the Nazi regime. It's a complicated relationship. Schmeling was really sort of an apolitical figure. A figure, he really didn't think much about politics. He'd been the heavyweight champion of the world before the Nazis had come along. He was really out for himself, as any athlete really would be. There was nothing unusual about him. But when the Nazis came, he sort of went along with the flow. The German term for it is Mitläufer, somebody who just really went along with things and became, in a way, a kind of apologist for the Nazi regime. Certainly never distanced himself from it, never criticized it, and was uniquely in a position to criticize it, at least early on. But that was something that he never chose to do. He let himself be used by the Nazis. I think he was both an opportunist and sort of naive about it all. He was not a heroic figure, especially, and he became sort of a spokesman for the Nazi regime, almost in spite of himself.
Okay. So they fight twice, we should say here. We're talking about the 80th anniversary of the second fight in 1938. The first fight is 1936, and it's in New York City, and the general sense I get is that Joe Louis took this fight lightly.
That's right. Joe Louis was really the heavyweight champion in waiting, and everybody was waiting because boxing was sort of in the doldrums then, and everybody figured that Joe Louis was the inevitable champion. He wasn't champion yet, but he was clearly going to be. And Schmeling was kind of, one more step along the way. He was over the hill and wasn't going to present much of a challenge to Louis, who was mowing down everybody who was coming his way. And so he was cocky about it. His training camp became sort of a social center for Black America, and he took it very, very lightly. Was totally overconfident. Schmeling, on the other hand, was a very meticulous and careful boxer. He had studied Louis very carefully. He had seen that Louis dropped his hands after throwing a right and was sort of open for, if you were willing to take a punch and get close to him, you could get to him. And Schmeling had figured that out. Schmeling famously told the press, "I see something." He had spotted a flaw in Louis's technique, but never elaborated upon it. And Schmeling knocked him out. And this was really an inconceivable outcome, and particularly in Black America, in Harlem and in all the Black communities in America, an absolutely devastating thing. I think, again, in the way that no athletic event before or since had ever been, because such hope and stock had been placed in him, and he was seen as all but invincible, and he was knocked out, and there was a kind of despair that set in that I describe in the book that's kind of inconceivable now. I mean, it would be as if, the national football team had lost, had been the overwhelming favorite and lost, but there was more psychically at stake because all of the hopes of really all of Black America and Blacks throughout the world. I mean, Louis, by that point, was already an international figure. So people were as upset in South Africa and other places as they were in Harlem or, the black neighborhoods in Chicago or Detroit or throughout the South.
Well, there's a quote from Langston Hughes, who was a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance, and he was a noted literary figure as well, and he described the national reaction to Louis's defeat in 1936. He said, "I walked down 7th Avenue. I saw grown men weeping like children, women sitting in the curbs with their heads in their hands. All across the country that night, when the news came that Joe Louis was knocked out, people cried," which gives a sense.
Yeah, no, that and it also gives a sense for the importance of boxing in that era. That a literary figure like Langston Hughes would be following it and writing about it so lyrically and movingly. I mean, this was the state of boxing in that era. It was a much more important sport than it's since descended into being. Second in America only to baseball at that time, and concentrated in the heavyweight championship, which was really the single greatest sporting prize in the world at that point. When people talked about the world championship, it wasn't hyperbole. I mean, people were following this all over the world. So when you say, Joe, that 70 million Americans were listening, there were tens of millions of people listening throughout the world. It was broadcast in several different languages. This was still very novel at that point. It was broadcast in Spanish and Portuguese. It was broadcast in German. The Nazi broadcaster was at ringside, so it was listened to all over Germany. The German announcer, who was, of course, a Nazi announcer, had set the whole thing up by saying that Schmeling was a more scientific boxer, and Schmeling was just a superior human being and a superior intellect, and this kind of racial superiority would win out. And damned if it didn't, at least in the eyes of the Germans. And so Schmeling became a hero of indescribable proportions in Germany.
You mentioned there Lewis's training retreat before the first fight against Schmeling in 36 became something of a social retreat as much as anything. And I was reading that he was introduced to the game of golf there, which became a lifelong passion. And he seemed to be fond of women as well. So he had just finished an affair with a Norwegian movie star. He was married as well to a Marva Trotter. And he recalled of that training retreat in 1936, girls were coming around like flies. I remember one time my trainer, Chappie, actually took a stick and threatened them, but I found them anyway. You might give us an insight into Lewis the person.
Well, you know, that's a great quote. I'm not sure. I don't think that's in my book. I don't know where you found that, but if my book is ever reprinted, I'm going to have to put that in there.
It's all yours.
Did I have that in there?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. No, okay. Well,
we still highly recommend your book, though.
Yeah, oh, good. Well, I appreciate that, but that's slightly embarrassing. Lewis, you know, Joe Louis was not a complicated guy. He was a very good-natured guy. He was not highly educated, quite basic, very decent. Sort of a little bit overwhelmed by the position that he was in. But sort of stepped up to the plate in a way, and wore his fame comfortably. He had been schooled in discretion. I mean, I don't think he was he certainly wasn't a radical figure in any. He wasn't going to stick his neck out very far, but he had been told to behave himself and to watch what he said and watch where he went, and never do anything that was going to bring shame to himself or to his race. He was kind of a standard bearer in spite of himself. And this kind of reminiscence that you just read, I mean, that kind of coverage was utterly absent at the time. I mean, whatever was going on very discreetly, and there wasn't a hint of any of this kind of scandal in the press about him. I mean, he had to be beyond reproach, and he was. So if this kind of thing was going on, it was hard for someone like me to document, because in the white press and the black press, it just wasn't reported on.
Yeah, well, I'm told that quote is from his autobiography, so in fairness, he's about the only one who could muster that up.
That's something that he would have said many years later. Yeah. None of that was visible at the time.
Okay. So how did he deal with defeat then?
Well, he sort of went into a funk. I mean, everybody went into a funk, and he disappeared for a while. I mean, there's a wonderful image of him returning to Detroit after the fight and sort of having to hide from the reporters, getting off on the train and sort of hiding behind a hat and escaping the press mob and retreating into seclusion for several days. I think he felt utterly humiliated, and as that lasted a little while, and then he resolved to come back. I mean, it was very clear that he was going to come back, and he was going to have to apply himself and discipline himself. And he vowed that kind of thing would never happen again.
I think most people have either heard of James Braddock or certainly seen Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe. So it was Braddock who was the world champion, actually, with Schmeling and Joe Louis knocking around the scene. And I guess for commercial reasons as much as political reasons, Braddock fights Louis. Louis beats him on June 22nd, 1937. He knocked him out in 8 rounds in Chicago, but publicly announced after the fight that he refused to recognise himself as world champion until he fought Schmeling again, which sets up this great moment in 38. That's the short version.
That's the short version, but that's exactly right. And the boxing world recognized that Joe Louis was an enormous draw, and that was the reason why Schmeling was manipulated out of the championship fight to which he was really entitled against Braddock. And of course, to the Nazis, this was just more, a further sign of Jewish wire pulling, that the Jews controlled the boxing world in the United States. And Schmeling had been rooked out of a championship fight. But the fact was that Louis was a much more charismatic figure, and boxing interests that were determined to see him become champion. And, he made short work of Braddock, who was, as they said in the idiom of the day, Braddock was very game. He was a gutsy, gritty fighter, but he couldn't beat Lewis.
I'm slightly confused about Schmeling at this stage. So we're talking about 1938, and things have moved on from 36 from a Nazi point of view. I did read him say, "I'm a fighter, I'm not a politician, I'm no Superman in any way," when he was reacting to the propaganda at the time. And I saw that he kept his Jewish manager, Joe Jacobs, despite the climate at the time. And I also read that in 38, I think, he gave 2 Jewish boys protection on a given night when they were being chased down by the Gestapo. So at that stage, as things were progressing across the 30s, was he starting to feel uneasy with Hitler's regime?
I don't think that he was feeling uneasy with the regime, and I think the fact that he kept his Jewish manager is very easily explained. I mean, the capital of boxing in the world was New York City.
Yeah.
And Schmeling was a very controversial and divisive figure, and to have a Jewish manager was an entree into America. And so it behooved the Nazis to let him keep his Jewish manager. I mean, that was not a gesture of great courage on Schmeling's part to have a Jewish manager. Okay. The Nazis never would have allowed it if it hadn't served their purposes.
Yeah.
And one thing that we didn't discuss was that after Schmeling won in 1936, the greeting that he received back in Germany, flying in and being received rapturously and meeting with Hitler. I mean, even if in his gut he was an apolitical figure, he was certainly used by the Nazis, and he was uniquely able to pull back from that because he was a former heavyweight champion, and he was famous throughout the world. He had a kind of independence that no other athletic figure, or really no other figure at all in Germany, might have had, but he did not use it in any way.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I mean, what you say about his sheltering 2 Jewish young men who were the sons of a merchant whom he knew on Kristallnacht, I think that Schmeling had a certain kind of personal decency. I mean, he was utterly manipulated by the Nazis, but on a micro level, he had a kind of decency to him, and he knew this family, and he took these guys in until, for a few days until the pogrom on Kristallnacht was over, and he should be praised for that.
Okay, yeah. So it's a muddied picture, really, and I saw that.
That's right. It's a very muddy picture.
Because when he travelled in 38 for the rematch against Joe Louis, his wife and mother were kept from travelling with him to avoid any chances of defection as well. And by the same token, there was an official Nazi Party publicist there as well who controlled any contrarian remarks and also issued statements along the lines of a black man could not defeat Schmeling because Schmeling was superior, obviously. And I saw Hitler as well lifted a nationwide curfew, which was 3 a.m. at the time, so that cafes and bars could carry the broadcast. So on that side of the pond, it was massive. And then in the US, needless to say, it was equally massive. A few weeks before the match, Lewis visited President Roosevelt at the White House, and the New York Times quoted Roosevelt telling Joe Louis, "Joe, we need your muscles like yours," or sorry, "Joe, we need muscles like yours to beat Germany." So no pressure.
Yeah, that's right. And again, it's just a reflection on how the heavyweight championship of the world was really the crown jewel in all of sports, and how much was riding on this fight. Again, in a way, I mean, there were other fights, Ali fights, that were followed all over the world. There's no doubt about that. And they were politically freighted, too, because Ali, was also a sensitizing figure and a controversial figure. But it was never as pure as it was in this instance, where you had symbols of freedom and fascism going up against one another, both worn by people who were a little bit unlikely as symbols, not doctrinaire people, but they were each carrying an enormous weight on themselves. They really were exemplars of 2 different ways of life, and I don't think that's ever happened again.
At this stage, Germany's invaded Austria and things are heating up in various quarters. So The fight itself, I mentioned NBC commentary had 70 million listeners alone, so I think it behoves us to have a listen. This was June 1938, Joe Louis against Schmeling for the second time.
And she's about to start with this Yankee Stadium packed to the doors. There isn't an empty seat. Joe Louis in his corner, prancing and rubbing his feet in the rosin. Max Schmeling standing calmly, getting last word from Doc Casey, and they're ready with the bell just about to ring. And there we are. Now Max is backing away against the ropes. Louis is following him and watching for that chance. He is crowding Schmeling. Schmeling is not slipping around very much, but his face is already marked, and they stepped into a fast clinch. And at close range, Louis fights desperately to bring up a left to the jaw and a right to the body, and coming out of that clinch, he got over a hard right and then stabbed Max with a good straight left jab, and Max backed away and missed the right. Louis then clapped him with two straight lefts to the face and brought over that hard right to the head, high on the temple, and Max tied him up in a clinch and broke ground. Is back against the ropes again. They're not too close to the ropes. Louis out, and Louis missed with a left swing, but in close, brought up a hard right overcut and a right to the jaw, and again a right to the body, a left hook, a right to the head, a left to the head, a right. Schmeling is going down, but he held to his feet, held to the rope, looked to his corner in helplessness, and Schmeling is down. Schmeling is down. The count is 4. And he's up, and Louis right and left to the head, a left to the jaw, a right to the head, and Donovan is watching carefully. Louis measures him right to the body, a left hook to the jaw, and Schmeling is down. The count is 5, 6, 7, 8. The men are in the ring. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Max Schmeling is beaten in 1 round. The first time that a World Heavyweight Championship ever changed hands in less than a round.
Yeah, it's fantastic stuff. We're talking
it's really, that's just one of the great moments in all of broadcasting. We should give credit to Clem McCarthy as the announcer. On
a good Irish name.
A good Irish name, right. And boxing was a very ethnic sport at that point, and with enormous numbers of Irish boxers. And in fact, there was even a time when Jewish boxers were taking Irish names, and Irish boxers were taking Jewish names, because those were the two of the important constituent groups among boxing fans.
It's funny, we have Jerry Eisenberg on the show from time to time, and he pinpoints listening to Louis Schmeling too as one of the great defining moments of his life, which prompted a lifelong love of the sport. You can just imagine an entire country sitting listening to Clem McCarthy's commentary there. It's an amazing thought, really. And I saw amongst the 70,000 fans, it's the usual glitz and glam as well. So you have Clark Gable there, and Gary Cooper and Gregory Peck and J. Edgar Hoover, and they take over $1 million at the time, $1 million at the gate receipts.
Yeah, in boxing, the demographics of boxing were interesting. I mean, it was a time when all kinds of glamorous people were sitting at ringside. And then there were, everybody else was sitting. I mean, this was at Yankee Stadium, and lots of people had gotten in for a few dollars and were sitting in the distant bleachers and could barely see anything. There were, 70 or 80,000 fans, and one of the wonderful things about that broadcast is to hear the fans react before Clem McCarthy can catch up with the action. I mean, you can sort of follow the fight just from the roars of the crowd.
And I read that Louis threw 41 punches, 31 landed. This fight lasted 2 minutes and 4 seconds. That sounds very, very dominant. And one of the wonderful sidelights of the fight is that there are many, many stories of people bending over, to pick up something that they had dropped and missing the fight because the fight was over, or people arriving late and the fight was over. There was one story that I got in the book where a guy was coming in and listening on the Lincoln or the Holland Tunnel coming into New York City, and the fight was starting just as he went into the tunnel, and by the time he got out of the tunnel, the fight was over. There were lots of people, even people at the stadium that night, who missed the fight. So what becomes of Joe Louis and what becomes of Max Schmeling? Well, Max Schmeling returns to Germany and sort of disappears for a while. I mean, again, there are lots of myths that built up around the fight and around him. And the story was that he was very much disparaged and discredited with the Nazis. That's not true.
He still appeared, and he still appeared in German magazines after the fight. They were sort of philosophical about his having lost it. And he goes into the German army during World War II. He's a paratrooper. He jumps into Crete. But he's never, he survives the war, and he comes back after the war and is sort of rehabilitated quickly. Coca-Cola gives him a franchise in Hamburg, and he becomes a very wealthy man. This is one of the great shames, really, in American sporting history, that an American company, a Southern American company, makes Max Schmeling a millionaire and would never use Joe Louis for endorsements. And so Joe Louis, retains the heavyweight championship into the late 40s, and makes a lot of money, loses a lot of money, gets into tax arrears for benefits that he threw during the war for the American Armed Forces. Lewis's end is a very sad one, a very common one in boxing, where the longer you fight, the more in debt you become. And Lewis ends up, as a greeter in Las Vegas. I suppose that nowadays he would have been taken care of better than he was. It really is a disgrace what happened to Lewis, whereas Schmeling lived a long life and died a millionaire.
Wow. They seemed to, I don't know what tensions were like at the time. Did they interact much, or were they friendly or not friendly? But certainly after the fight, they seemed to have developed a friendship. And I read that Schmeling, and you've explained now that he had money to spare, sent money to cover the costs, or cover some of the costs at Lewis's funeral, and even gave him some money while he was still alive just to help him, and given that he was in difficult circumstances.
Well, there's no doubt that they were trotted out from time to time, and they made some joint appearances. I think, again, part of the mission that I had in writing this book was to clear up some of the mythology that grew up around the fight and around these guys. And I think that, we're Americans particularly, but I guess human beings are sentimental people, and we want everything to end up very amicably. I think that the degree to which these guys were really friendly was exaggerated. And there's no evidence, for instance, that Schmeling paid for Joe Louis's funeral. I mean, I interviewed Joe Louis's old lawyer, Truman Gibson, the late Truman Gibson, and he told me that there was really nothing to that.
Right, okay.
So I think it's easy to exaggerate their friendship, but there's no doubt that they were perfectly comfortable with one another, and they made several joint appearances.
Did Lewis?
And they were never, they never really. I don't think Lewis was certainly not a hater, and I don't think that. I mean, he sort of, he hated Schmeling that night in a way, and he said if the fight had gone on much longer, he might have killed him. But I don't, that was a matter of boxing more than anything else. And I don't think that Lewis ever hated Schmeling, and I think he was sort of an amiable guy, and I don't think that he ever really took any of it very personally.
Did Lewis die a bitter man, or was he philosophical about how life turned out?
I don't think that Lewis was a bitter man. I don't think Lewis had any bitterness in him. I think that he died. I think other people were indignant over his sort of degraded state at the end of his life, but I don't think that Lewis himself felt that way. It wasn't his nature.
Okay, and he never became overtly political as the years went on. It wasn't in his nature.
No,
either,
in no way was he ever political. He was a great patriot. He never seemed to be embittered by the way that the American tax authorities inexcusably came after him. I mean, he was a great patriot. He served his country well, and he deserved a much better fate.
Well, listen, David, thanks so much for your time. David Margolick, author of Beyond Glory, Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, and A World on the Brink. It really is just an amazing story, and we're 80 years on from it. Is there any broad final words you want to say about it, David?
Well, only that it represents a very grim time in world history and in American history, and I think that the story of this fight is sort of it's just a wonderfully uplifting moment. And it was an uplifting moment for Lewis, and it was an uplifting moment for race relations, and really an uplifting moment for America and the world. And it was all on the shoulders of this very simple but dignified man. And I think it's an inspiring story.
David, thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.